It's their first taste of freedom. Researchers are releasing several Przewalski horses into the wild.
It's the only truly wild horse on Earth.
It was their first taste of freedom. After generations behind fences, several horses were about to step into a world they had never known. A world without barns, without humans bringing food, without clean water waiting for them every morning. December 1986. A cargo plane landed in one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Inside were 11 horses. Researchers had brought them thousands of miles from zoos in Europe and America, hoping they could do something that sounded impossible: bring life back to a dying land. But almost everyone watching believed they were sending those animals to their deaths. Because this was not a green valley. This was the Yungar Basin of China. A place where the ground was cracked, the winds were brutal, and winters could drop below freezing temperatures that most animals could not survive. There was barely any grass, barely any water, and for years, the desert had been growing. Local people had watched the land disappear little by little until some stopped calling it farmland. They called it the place where nothing grows. The BBC even arrived to document the release. But after only 2 days, the crew left. They believed they were witnessing a conservation failure before it had even begun. Because these were not normal wild animals. These were zoo-born horses. They had spent their entire lives eating food given by humans and drinking from automatic water systems. They had never searched for water, never escaped predators, never survived a desert winter. To many scientists, releasing them here was not conservation. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. But these horses were different. They were Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species left on Earth. A living connection to the ancient world. Thousands of years ago, these animals roamed across the Asian steppe. Their ancestors were the same type of horses painted on cave walls by humans tens of thousands of years ago. Unlike domestic horses, they were never fully tamed. They never became farm animals. They never depended on humans. They remained wild. But by the 20th century, they were almost gone. Hunting, habitat loss, and human expansion pushed them to the edge of extinction. At one point, fewer than 40 remained. The entire species survived because of a handful of animals kept in zoos. And now, after decades of protection, China wanted to return them to the land where they once belonged. But there was a bigger reason behind this project. The horses were not just being saved. They were being brought back because scientists believed they could save the desert. Because the Yungar Basin was not always a wasteland. For thousands of years, wild horses had shaped this ecosystem. Their movement, grazing, and migration helped maintain the balance of the land. But when they disappeared, something unexpected happened. The soil began to change. Without animals moving across the ground, the surface hardened. Rain could no longer easily enter the earth. Water rushed away or evaporated. Plants struggled to grow. The land slowly became weaker. Then the desert started spreading. Dust storms carried the soil hundreds of miles away. Cities far from the desert began feeling the effects. People were literally breathing the ground from a place they had never visited. China tried everything. They planted forests, built barriers, created artificial solutions. But the desert kept fighting back. Because the problem was not just the sand. The problem was that the ecosystem had lost something important. An animal that had been part of the system for thousands of years. So one group of scientists proposed an unusual idea. Instead of fighting nature, bring back the creature that once helped control it. Bring back the wild horse. At first, government officials were skeptical. The idea sounded almost impossible. How could horses raised in captivity survive a place where even experienced animals struggled? But the situation had become so serious that the plan was approved. The project had 3 steps. First, bring the horses to China and allow them to adapt. Second, teach them survival skills in large natural areas. Third, release them completely into the wild. The first horses arrived at a breeding center near Jimsar. Among them was a young stallion with a white mark on his face. His name was Hong. Nobody knew it yet, but this horse would become one of the most important animals in the entire project. Because scientists were about to discover something incredible. The instincts these horses needed to survive were not gone. They were simply hidden. For generations, humans had provided everything for them: food, water, protection. But deep inside their DNA was something older, a memory of survival. And soon, the desert was going to test whether that memory was still alive. The first winter arrived, and it was far worse than anyone expected. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. Snow covered the little vegetation that existed. The horses struggled. Some developed frostbite. Some lost weight. The scientists watched carefully, unsure if their experiment had failed. The critics seemed right. Maybe these animals had been away from nature for too long. Maybe the wild instincts were gone forever. But then something happened. Something nobody had predicted. The horses began changing. They started breaking ice with their hooves to reach hidden water. They learned where snow-covered grass could still be found. The mares formed protective circles around their young during storms. They used their own bodies to block the freezing wind. They were learning, not from humans, from the land itself. The same land their ancestors had survived on for thousands of years. By spring, researchers noticed something strange. The areas where the horses had moved were beginning to recover. The grass was returning. The soil was changing. The desert was showing signs of life. The horses had not destroyed the ecosystem. They had started rebuilding it. But surviving one winter was not enough. The real test was still ahead. Because if these animals could truly return to the wild, they had to prove they could survive without fences, without help, without humans. And that moment was coming. The day the gates opened, and 11 forgotten wild horses walked into a desert that was waiting to see if they still belonged. The first winter should have ended the experiment. At least, that is what many people believed. The critics thought these horses were too far removed from nature. 3 generations had lived behind fences. They had never searched for food, never escaped predators, never faced the brutal conditions of the wild. But the desert proved something different. The instincts were still there. They had not disappeared. They had only been waiting. And as the years passed, the impossible started happening. The horses were not just surviving. They were changing the land around them. Scientists began noticing that areas where the horses grazed were recovering faster than areas without them. Their hooves broke the hardened surface of the soil. Every step created tiny spaces where rainwater could enter instead of disappearing across the desert. The ground that had once rejected water slowly started absorbing it again. The horses were rebuilding the desert one step at a time. But their biggest impact came from something much simpler: their movement. Wild horses do not stay in one place. They travel. They graze. They move across huge areas. And that constant movement creates balance. Some areas are eaten down. Others are left untouched. Different plants get a chance to grow. Small animals return. Insects return. The entire ecosystem begins to wake up. Even their waste played a role. What looked like ordinary manure became a natural delivery system. Seeds from plants traveled through the horses and were spread across the landscape. Plants that had disappeared for years started returning. The desert was not dead. It was waiting for the right animal to come back. Then came the biggest test. Could these horses truly survive without human help? In 2001, after years of preparation, researchers opened the next chapter. A group of Przewalski's horses was released into the Kalamali Nature Reserve. No fences, no feeding, no safety net, just thousands of kilometers of harsh wilderness. Among them was Hong, the young stallion with the white mark on his face. Now he was older, stronger, and he was about to show everyone what was still hidden inside these animals. At first, the horses stayed close to where they were released. They moved carefully, almost like they were unsure. They had spent their lives near humans. The open desert was unfamiliar. But then something changed. On the 8th day, Hong started walking. Not randomly, not searching. He moved with purpose. The other horses followed. Researchers watched the GPS signals as the group traveled farther and farther. Several kilometers. Then more. They continued in a straight direction. The scientists were confused, because Hong was heading somewhere nobody expected. A place that was not marked on their maps. Eventually, the horses reached a hidden water source. A small spring surrounded by the desert. A place they had somehow found. Nobody had shown them. Nobody had trained them. Some scientists believed they were following ancient instincts. Others believed they were reading the landscape in ways humans could not understand. Whatever the reason, the wild was coming back. The horses began creating their own territories. Young foals were born outside captivity, and these new generations were different. They learned survival from their mothers. They understood the environment. They reacted to predators. They knew where to find food and water. They were becoming truly wild again. Then something even bigger happened. The landscape began changing from above. Satellite images showed green areas expanding around the places where the horses lived. Plants returned. Animals followed. Insects appeared. Birds returned to feed on them. Small mammals came back. And eventually, predators returned too. The return of one animal had started rebuilding an entire food chain. For decades, humans had tried to defeat the desert with machines, trees, and artificial solutions. But the horses were doing something different. They were restoring a system that had existed long before humans tried to control it. By the 2020s, the project had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The original 11 horses had become hundreds. The empty desert was becoming a living ecosystem again. The animals that were once considered a hopeless experiment became proof of something scientists had forgotten. Nature has its own engineers. Creatures that shape landscapes. Creatures that maintain balance. Creatures that humans often remove without realizing their importance. The Przewalski's horses were not just an endangered species being saved. They were a reminder. The world was not broken because nature failed. It was broken because important pieces were missing. The horses were one of those missing pieces. And when they returned, the land remembered what to do. Because sometimes the solution to an environmental disaster is not creating something new. Sometimes it is bringing back what was there all along. The 11 horses that stepped off that plane in 1986 were expected to disappear. Instead, they became the beginning of a comeback story. A story showing that even a desert that looks completely dead can still be waiting for life to return.